Hi everyone and welcome to the Colour Cave where we like to play with art stuff. My name's Jem and I am not a painter. As some of you will know that I have been throwing myself into trying out the wonderful medium of watercolour recently, and being the person that I am, I like to sort of throw myself in at the deep end and make things as difficult as possible. One of the things that I see cropping up is people asking about different watercolour papers, and some people say that the paper doesn't matter, it's all about your skill level, and other people have said what struck a chord with me, and that is get the best paper that you can afford. What I've got today for you is a selection of watercolour papers in a variety of price ranges. Seeing that as this is an experiment, and I do like a good experiment, I am keeping all the other variables constant, so my skill level is obviously not going to change in the next couple of hours. But not only that, I am going to use budget paintbrushes and student grade watercolour, which in this case is the Winsor & Newton Cotman colours. And it's just going to let you see some comparable results. Okay, so the first thing that we have is this Faber-Castell mixed media paper. This is A5 size, and all of my calculations and costings, which I'll put up on the screen as I go, are based on sheets of paper roughly being this size. So that's kind of like 8 by 5 inches if you don't work in the standardised paper sizes. So this is 250 GSM paper. A kind of benchmark for watercolour paper is 300 GSM, so it is a slightly heavier weight paper. But this, when I first started out trying out watercolour and when I was using watercolour pencils, mixed media paper was a good place to start because I didn't want the expense of actually having to buy watercolour paper. So with this, I paid £6.95 for the pad, and there's 30 sheets in this pad, so that works out at about 23p per sheet, which in terms of watercolour paper is about as cheap as you're going to get. The next thing that I have is W.H. Smith watercolour paper, and I would deem this a budget watercolour paper. This is an A3 size pad, so it's a monster, and I paid the princely sum of £4.49 for 12 sheets of this. This is 300 GSM paper weight, so it's kind of at that sort of benchmark that you're looking for. Next up we have the Faber-Castell watercolour paper, and this is obviously from the same vein as the mixed media paper, but it's just a slightly heavier weight. So this is also 300 GSM, and it comes in this lovely A5 size, which weirdly I find is a really nice size to paint on. I like this size of paper. It is also acid free, and there's 10 sheets that come in this pad, so it works out at about 56p per sheet. Moving up through the ranks, we have the Strathmore 400 series watercolour paper. This is cold press watercolour paper, and it's the first one out of the collection that I have to state that it's cold press. Now the difference between cold press and hot press paper is just that, how the paper is actually squashed together. Cold press is done with cold rollers, and what that does is it gives you a texture to your paper. If I just tilt that in the light, you'll be able to see that there is definitely something there. It's not smooth, it's not flat at all. I like cold press paper, and all of the papers that I have in this experiment all have some sort of texture, so lean more towards that cold press idea. Hot press paper is another video altogether. It is also 300 GSM as well, which is really nice. That's what we want. There are 12 sheets that come in this pad, so that works out about £1.08 per sheet. So you can see the prices starting to go up. The thing I will say about this is for your £1.08, it is a much bigger sheet of paper than the A5 size. If I just pull up one of the A5 size pads again, just to show you the size difference, so it is substantially bigger. So I suppose even if you wanted to make it a little bit fairer and cut that in half again, it would be slightly smaller than A5 size. I notice a huge jump personally just in touching the paper, the difference between the Strathmore paper and the other papers, and I would say, I don't know if this is going to make any sense to any of you, but this feels more like watercolour paper. Last but certainly not least is one of the big boys, and this is the Arche cold press watercolour paper, also 300 GSM, and it's the first one out of everything that I have that states that it is 100% pure cotton, and a lot of people have told me if you want really good quality watercolour paper, it's best to go with the pure cotton stuff because it warps less. There's 12 sheets in this pad, and this is a 9" by 12", so not standardised paper sizes. And this is also, as I say, the cold pressed paper, so it has got very much a texture to it. And it does feel slightly rougher than the Strathmore paper when you run your hand over it. So this comes out at 64p per half sheet. So again, if I just show you the comparison, there's an A5 sheet, so you would easily get 2 A5 sized drawings or paintings out of one of these large sheets. So that's why I've worked it out at 64p per half sheet to keep the sizes the same. So here I have our different papers, and I have them in ascending order of price. So the cheapest one is the W.H. Smith watercolour paper, closely followed by the Faber-Castell mixed media, all the way up to the Arche cold pressed paper down in this right hand corner. The first thing you'll see that there is a noticeable colour difference between the top row and the bottom row, and that is most likely due to the composition of the paper, i.e. these two probably, well, this one definitely has more cotton because it's 100% cotton, but these ones probably have more cotton in them than pulp compared to the top row. You can see as well that out of all the papers, the Arche paper is the most textured. Again, if I just kind of tip that a little bit, you should be able to see, yet the others look quite smooth. I can tell you that they all have texture. The one with the least amount of texture is the mixed media paper, and interestingly it is also the only paper that is 250 GSM, all the rest are 300. So one of the first things that we want to test, and that is really, really important about watercolour paper, is how much water the paper can actually hold, how much it's going to absorb it, and how long it's going to sit before it dries to let you keep manipulating that paint. The other thing we want to see initially as well is how it actually takes the paint. Is it going to soak it up straight away, and are you going to be left struggling to get any sort of texture or movement in it? And also, is it going to do anything to the richness of the colour? All I'm doing here is I am using a budget paintbrush. This is a number 8 round, and I got this in a set from Flying Tiger, which is one of my favourite shops. The set of 4 or I think it was 5 brushes cost me about £4, so these are like the cheapest of cheap brushes, and I'm strangely attached to them. So all I'm going to do is wet that brush tip first, and I am going to use a wet and wet technique whereby I am going to put water all over the paper before I start. So I am essentially soaking the paper to give myself something to work on. So what you want to do when you're doing this, listen to me talking like I know what I'm doing and I'm a professional. This is only what I have learned. You want there to be a sheen on the paper, but you do not want there to be puddles of paint anywhere, because if you've got puddles, then you've got too much water. So I'm just tilting my head slightly here, and I can see that it does look as if it's got a sheen on it and there's nothing pulling anywhere. So I'm just going to get stuck in and dip my brush straight into the paint. And I'm going to start at the top, and what I want to do is I want to pull this paint down towards the bottom. One of the things that you can do if you're new to washes is you can tilt your work surface slightly towards you, and that helps pull the paint down the way. So now that I've come to here, I'm just going to dip my brush back in the water, and I'm going to fade this out to almost nothing. So I can tell you straight away, and you can see by where the thicker paint is sitting, that the paper is actually starting to buckle, and it's starting to come up in the middle, and the paint is actually pulling it down the sides. So that is your W.H. Smith watercolour paper. And here we go with the mixed media paper. Now I'm interested with this one because although I have used this mixed media paper for various projects, I have never done a wash on it with watercolour. And I can tell you that laying down the water, it feels very dry. It's not, the water is not gliding across the paper, and it's certainly not sticking to the paper. Already, we will have to wait until they're dry, but you can see straight away the place where I dipped my brush in the water is far less obvious on the mixed media paper than it is on the WH Smith watercolour paper. So there you go, that's something worth noting straight off the bat before we've even done anything else. Alright, let's move on to the Faber-Castell watercolour paper. So same thing again, I'll get the procedure down here. This water is soaking into this paper really quickly. Really quickly. I'm going to have to go quick. Okay, dip my brush in. Let's go. Yep, this is soaking up the paint so quickly. I'm running out of paint already. And look where I am. I can't, oh, right, okay, there's me dipping my brush in the water. Try to pull this down. I'm not even going to make it to the bottom, I don't think. Right, let's try and... I'm struggling to pull the watercolour paint down as well because most of it has soaked into the paper already. This is drying so quickly. Good grief. And you can see the uptake of the pigment isn't that great either. You can also see the texture difference as well now. This is getting really interesting. This is interesting. I'm interested in this, but I do like a good proper science-based experiment. Being the sciencey person that I am. So now we're down onto the slightly more expensive paper. So we've got the Strathmore 400 paper here, and this is the Arche paper. I am having to work a bit to put water on this, not unlike the mixed media paper. You have to remember as well that the Strathmore paper is the first paper that has a considerable amount of texture compared to the previous ones, so it might take a little bit longer to work in some of that water. It's much easier to manipulate the colour and actually pull it down as well. I am finding that. I mean, look how rich that paint is. I'm going to call that the midway dip. Alright, and on to our final piece of paper. Now with the top row beginning to dry, just from where I'm sitting here, I can tell you that the WH Smith paper is warping considerably more than the other two. They've all come up in this sort of U shape, but the WH Smith paper where this, I'm better not point with a wet brush, I might make a mistake. This part here where you can see just above the paler part, that's actually buckled in the way, as in down towards the desk as well, so that is not coping well with the water, which for watercolour paper, that's not great. Alright, and finally the Arche cold press. Oh, that's nice. That feels delightful. I noticed straight away as well that the paint seems to sit more evenly. See, as I'm dragging it down, when I'm working from side to side like that, it just seems to be sitting a lot better on the paper. So here is my midpoint dip. The paint isn't going as far. And it's trying to take everything it can from my brush. Give me the paint, it's mine. I've kind of sloshed half of it over the side, which doesn't help. I feel as if I could go forever. It doesn't feel as if it's drying out any. You know, I feel as if I could keep pushing the paint about here forever more, and it wouldn't make too much of a difference. Alrighty, so that is the first part of the wash. I'm just going to let these dry and I'll be back in just a second. Okay guys, I've brought you down to table level so that we can assess the buckling. And you can see the WH Smith paper has actually strained against the tape because it's buckled that much. It's trying to pop itself out. One of the giveaways of bad buckling is when your little white border starts to show. And that's because the paper is pushing its way up. So it's, yeah. It's probably the worst offender, I would say. If we move on to the mixed media paper, it is surprisingly flat. It looks great when you see it next to this one in the state of the tape. It's actually done really well. And in terms of the Faber-Castell watercolour paper, there is like a kind of like a bump in the middle, but it's not horrendous. Apart from that, it's pretty flat. If we move down to the Strathmore paper, there is literally no buckling. There is a tiny, tiny bit just there, but that is it, and there's hardly any movement in that at all when I do that compared to up here. And lastly, the Arche paper, and there seems to be a bit of a divot in the middle, but again, there's not a lot of movement there, and if you look at the tape around the outside, it's exactly where I left it. So that's, I just thought I would give you this sort of slightly more interesting view. I know my camera works terrible, but I just thought it would be nice for you to see it close up like that and how it's actually sitting on the table. This has chucked up some quite interesting results. First of all, little disclaimer, this was me. That's not, I was cleaning up some of the paint that had gone over the sides. Rather than allowing me to move that water about and mix it in with the paint that was already on the paper, it's as if I've actually lifted the paint off, which I'm going to be doing deliberately just shortly, but clearly I don't need to do it with the W.H. Smith paper. I thought that the mixed media paper was quite surprising, although there is quite a definitive line there, especially on the camera. It is more pronounced on the camera. That is actually quite a smooth gradient, bar this part in the middle, and the paper has taken this quite well. I'm quite impressed. The Faber-Castell watercolour, you've got this horrible sort of bleeding type effect that you've got over here as well, so that's not great. You should be able to have enough time to move the paint about on the paper. If we come down here, this is kind of more what I expected from the slightly more expensive papers. There is a definite gradient there, and I would say that it's probably one of the better ones. And again, you can see where I've plonked the water down there, but it's much less pronounced than this one here, for example. And there's still quite a rich layer of colour on that top half, even though I kind of swished the brush about everywhere. Moving on to the Arche paper, this is why expensive paper is expensive. Despite me plonking a clean wet brush slap bang in the middle of that, I was still able to manipulate the paint and move it round, and I have got a very delicate and very nice gradient there. This part here, it isn't actually the paint that's darker, it's just because there's a little buckle in the paper. I can see the light casting on it and it looks as if I've got a dark sort of squish across there, but that's just lovely. So the next thing that I want to test out is the ability to lift wet paint off the paper, and it's something that I found I quite like to use to lighten an area up, fix mistakes, because I do a lot of that. Any of you who have seen any painting from me previously will know that there's a lot more taking off than putting on. But the other thing as well is you can get some quite nice effects with it. But what we don't want it to do is lift this wash off as well. We only want to take off the colour that we're actually putting down. And I'm just going to sort of dab some in here and there. You know, very haphazard, you know, the way I do. I like to do these things. And then I'm going to go, oh, I don't want that there. That's not going to look good. So what you want to do when you're trying to lift paint off is you want to use a clean brush that is no more than damp. And basically you want to try and take off some of that paint. So wipe your brush and then go back in again and just try and lift it off and see what it does underneath as well. So you can see there that the white of the paper is starting to show through, and that is because it is lifting the layer of paint that is underneath as well. Now, if you were to go quite heavy with it, you would expect that, but if you're only going lightly like I'm doing here, you would kind of hope that some of what was underneath would stay there. So, you know, that's another interesting point. That's not bad actually. Oh, we've got more buckling. I can feel it. It's like groaning under the weight of my paintbrush. Oh no, I've made a terrible mistake. So straight away, this mixed media paper is doing a much better job of this. although it has taken some of the pigment off, it has left most of what's underneath, and I've actually got a really nice kind of like cloudy effect going on there. I might just squash that over and join that together. So you can see there it's a lot more delicate, it's a lot more subtle. This looks as if I've made a mistake and tried to fix it. This one, not so much. I am super impressed with this. You go, little mixed media paper. Now that, interestingly, is doing a much better job of lifting the paint and not disturbing the layer underneath. Yeah, that's done a pretty good job. You can see there that most of the colour from underneath is actually coming through, it's showing through, so that's great. We'll go down to the Strathmore paper now. That's picking that up reasonably well, but I do feel as if it's kind of just moving the paint about. It's not, but that's more to do with the paintbrush. But it's funny that it's behaving differently on this paper. So the paint is behaving differently in that it's trying to find a way for, you know, past my brush, as opposed to just sitting where it should be and letting the brush lift it. The highest quality paper is proving itself straight away. It's letting me lift that paint off no problem. I'm not chasing it round the paper, and it's also not touching the layer underneath, which is just fabulous. Look at that. Alright then, so you can see those all side by side, and I would say that they are shea paper. Again, the mixed media paper did better than I expected with this, but not as well as the Faber-Castell watercolour. So the next thing that we want to do now is we do want to layer some colours. It is straight dioxazine purple if anybody is interested. It's not a mixed colour or, you know, anything like that. It's just straight off the cake. It's not called a cake, what's it called? A pan. Straight off the pan. So that makes me think of food. Pans. Food. So this is quite a rich purple. So I'm going to water it down just very, very slightly. And all I want to do is, I don't know, I'm going to stick a tree branch or something up on there. Now, one of the sort of allure of watercolour for people is the fact that it is quite transparent. And you can use that transparency to your advantage to get a little bit of texture and depth and just, you know, some quite interesting lines into your picture. It's quite important that we are able to layer colours, and it's not going to pick up the colour that's underneath number one and change, you know, muddy the colour that you actually want to use, but also that you can still add more and more to it and make it, you know, that little bit more layered. Use that layered effect without it just sort of giving up on you. I'm finding this quite difficult because of the contours of the paper now. It's like, oh, this is going to be a funky tree. So that seems to have taken that okay. It's not impacted by what's going on underneath, which is quite nice. And I can see my layers where I've put the extra brush strokes on. I can actually see them, so that's quite nice. I have to say this mixed media paper, it doesn't feel nice. It kind of like, it feels like putting marker down on marker paper, you know, it's really, really smooth. And it's not, the paper is starting to pill very, very slightly. But yeah, it's not really liking having to take more layers. That's interesting. I really, really like painting trees. I think it's one of my favourite things to do. I don't like drawing trees, incidentally, but I think painting them's quite sort of liberating. It's quite sort of therapeutic because you can kind of just let your brush do what it wants to do. And again, seems to be taking layers quite nicely. I've got to kind of wait for them to dry to see how much they're going to stand out. The other thing that you can see quite clearly as well is that this mixed media paper isn't coping so well with the layers of colour. You can see that this looks really, really muddy compared to this one and this one. Now fair enough, this is much darker on the bottom part of the picture, but even if you compare the branches further up, it seems to, it doesn't seem to want to sit on top of it as well as the other ones. This one is really, really bright. It's really, really vibrant. But again, there seems to be a lot less paint in the background, so I'll let you make up your own minds about that. Let's go. Oh, my watch is vibrating. Why is my watch vibrating? Oh my goodness. I've met my step goal for today now, considering I'm painting. That says a lot, doesn't it? I'm earning steps because I'm moving my wrist violently. Yeah, nice one, Garmin. That's nice. I feel as if I could keep going and that this paper would take much more paint on top of what I've already done. And it's letting me see my brush strokes as well, and they are much, much smoother than on this paper. Again, I'm going to zoom into them individually and let you see what I'm talking about, because I know that you can't really see what I'm doing, but I'm just trying to explain as I go here. Oh, that's going down like butter. Now, considering this paper is so textured, I find that really, really weird, but the colour is so rich. I feel as if I've got a lot more control of the paint as well on the paper. And I think that that might be in part to the actual texture of the paper, because there is that texture there, your brush can't sort of like glide off away from you. That feels really nice. Okay, so next up we're going to try and add more paint over already stressed areas. And what I want to do is I want to darken the corners of this painting just to make it look like a sort of darker sky. I am going to use the big brush that I was using before, which was the size 8. And what I'm going to do is I just want to wet more or less the top half of the picture. So I'm not absolutely drenching it, but I am going to soak that down just round about those trees as well. And one of the tests of this as well is, once I've put the water on, is to look and see how much of the paint it's lifted off. And I don't know how well you can see that, but it has taken some of that paint off, and that is absolutely bone dry. So that's not good if you want to layer your washes as well, which again is a really, really common technique that's used. So I'm just going to pop in some of this indigo here, and I just want to kind of like smoosh it around and darken up the top part of this picture. Now I can tell you straight away, I have no confidence in this paper being able to give me the effect that I want, because it's just not going to do it. I know it's not going to do it, but I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. So what I'm doing now is I'm just cleaning off that indigo from my brush and just putting some fresh clean water on it so that I can start to kind of blend this down a little bit. So that looks okay just now. I just want to pop a little. Again, if your paper's wet, you should be able to dab in paint like this and it should start to spread out in amongst the areas of your paper that are still wet. And I am struggling to get it to do that. I really, really am. It's just kind of like sitting there, and to get it to do what I want, I'm having to add even more water, which the paper really can't take anyway. So that's a bit it's a bit concerning, to say the least. That is starting to lift the paint from the tree trunk, just here. And I mean, I'm just tickling that, so, and it's now spreading it over on this side as well. So I think the Faber-Castell mixed media paper has met its limit. Right, let's try over here. Oh, this paper just feels so dry. The Faber-Castell watercolour paper, it just feels horrible. It's starting to get bitty as well, you know, the paper's starting to pill a little bit when I was doing that. Again, this paper's quite textured and I seem to be able to control where I want this to go as long as the paper's not absolutely soaking. But what that does mean is I'm struggling to move it about the way I want it to. So that has a plus and a minus side, definitely. Let's just go for it. Right, see now this is a nice balance of movement and control. I'm not struggling to keep the paint where I want it, but nor am I struggling to shift it about. Now that tree is staying put really well considering the amount of water that I've squished on there. I can still see the branches, it's not taking it off completely, so that's quite impressive as well. And this paint instantly wants to travel, like you can see it spidering out already down here. It's like, oh, let me go. Let's go play, there's water here. Where there's water, I can go. And that's really what watercolour should do, I think. I think that's the idea, generally speaking. When you're, well, certainly when you're working wet on wet, that is for sure the idea. And that was so easy. There was minimal effort required for me there to do that. I don't even have to smooth that out because it's doing it itself. Okay, the final test, that can waft away in the background. The other thing that I wanted to show you, I know that in a lot of painting nowadays, especially the more sort of illustrative type watercolour, there is a tendency to use fine liners. Let's have 3 different fine liners and show you how they behave on the paper as well. So I've got, it's Pigma Microns, I've got, these aren't particularly expensive. So I have got the Micron PN, which is the plastic nib, and that is like one of the old be-all handwriting pens. It's just a really hard plastic nib that's on it. And I also have a Pigma Micron 01, which is kind of like a standard line width that most people would use. And I also have my favourite, which is the smallest nib that they have, which is a 003. I mean, you can barely see that against my hand, but they produce the most delicate, cute little lines ever. So what I want to do is just draw a couple of shapes on these with these different pens so that you can see how they behave on each of the paper. This is the PN. And it feels quite dry on that paper, but it's very consistent and there seems to be no issues. So I'm just going to fill a bit in here. I'm going to do a bit of colouring in here, and it's kind of struggling a little bit. It's starting to leave little gaps when I was scrubbing away there, you know, moving in a circular motion, so that's not great. The 0.1 next. That's gliding onto the paper absolutely fine. There's no issues there whatsoever. So let's have a wee colour in with it as well. And that's also going down, no problem at all. And finally, let's use the 003. And that is actually doing surprisingly well as well. It doesn't like that paper too much for filling in, but you really wouldn't be using that size of nib for that kind of thing. So I'm going to do the same for all of these. If there's any major disasters, I'll let you know. Okay, the PN is really happy on the mixed media paper, and I am not surprised at that in the slightest. Yep, all good. Let's see how we get on here. The PN feels a little bit clumsy on it, but it's not really an issue. It's still going down okay, everything seems to be fine there. Oh, the Pigma Micron's not very happy. My grass looks non-existent with that. I don't think it's going to put anything down at all with the 003. Oh no, that's fine. That's weird. Again, no problems down here. I will say with the Strathmore paper and with the Arche paper, you'll probably have to take your time a little bit more on the surface, because it is quite textured. The 03 isn't coping too well on this, but the 01 and the plastic nib one seem to be great. Oh no. Okay, the PN is an absolute no. It's, oh no. Okay, PN's a definite no-no for that. Let's try the 01. Better? Much better. Okay, yep, all good there. And the 003, again, struggling. Yeah, really struggling. Okay, so super close-up time. This is the W.H. Smith watercolour paper, and you can see that first of all it's not done very well in terms of buckling. It's pretty warped. Yeah, which is not great for watercolour paper really. I know it's cheap watercolour paper, but that's a bit too much of a curvature for my liking, considering there was only 2 layers really of water that went onto that. Not great for washes, and you can see that where the paper has buckled, it's actually popped out of the tape that was holding it down, and my second wash has leaked into my border area. It's not bad in terms of layering, in the sense that it's allowing the transparency of the colours underneath to show through. Unfortunately, when I went to lift the paint, it was lifting up the layer underneath as well. Overall, I just wouldn't recommend it. I had to kind of fight with this paper quite a lot, but for, I think, what did we say, 9p a sheet, you know, okay, fine, fair enough. Moving on, surprisingly, is the Faber-Castell mixed media paper. This is done okay actually, it's done reasonably well. What I did find was though that when we got to this third layer of paint, and you might just be able to see it in that corner, but the paper's starting to pill a little bit, you know, it's starting to lift. And I don't think it would have taken much more than that. Now, with this little picture in general, I would be using maybe another 4 or 5 layers of wash for the sky, plus adding more in here, and I genuinely don't think that the mixed media paper would be able to take it. If you want to use it for a little bit of watercolour, I think it's actually okay. Next in line we have the Faber-Castell watercolour paper, and for me this was the biggest disappointment because this is actually watercolour paper. Where I have layered my brush strokes, you can see that it's actually like, it's just started to spread on its own in places. It's not actually kept the shape of my brush stroke, and it's all started to bleed out into the texture of the paper. I do not want a knobbly bobbly tree trunk unless I make it a knobbly bobbly tree trunk. So I'm not that impressed with this, and the wash wasn't that great either. It was just a bit disappointing, and I would actually take the mixed media paper over the watercolour paper. Buckling, not too bad, a little bit there, but not horrendous. At least it's uniform, you know, the whole thing has gone into this sort of, you know, U shape, which again isn't really any sort of disaster, but it's not warped the paper in any way. You know, there's no sort of dinkles or dents in it elsewhere. This is now the Strathmore paper, and if I compare this one to this one side by side, when you look at the darker colours, they are much richer. And this was just straight paint I used. I didn't dilute this when I was, you know, doing the different paintings. This all came out the same well in my palette, which was this one. And the richness of colour is far better, and the same with the background colours as well. If you look at the indigo along the top, it's just much deeper, and the paper seems to hold the paint much better, and I was really struggling to sort of like make this darker, whereas this paper took it much better, and it also distributed the paint much better on that second layer within the water as well. And down the bottom's just lovely. I mean, it's just so nice for a wash. Lastly, we have the Arche paper, and you can see here I dropped a splodge of water on it by accident, and it lifted the indigo paint off, and look underneath, you can see the pink is still there. That mauve colour is still there in all its glory. It hasn't lifted the mauve off, which is exactly what I would want my watercolour to do. In terms of the depth here, you can see that it's distributed itself quite evenly, and what that has resulted in is not as dark a colour as the previous one, which is the Strathmore paper. However, you would build up more layers of that, and you would be able to do it repeatedly to get exactly what you want. And the buckling on this is minimal as well. You can see there's a slight kink here, but apart from that, that's pretty flat, and that, again, that's what I would expect from good quality watercolour paper. So even side by side with the buckling, you can see which ones are flatter. These two are much flatter than these ones up here. This one's all the way up at the bottom. So overall, in terms of actually looking at the pictures now, although I used the same technique in all of them, they've all turned out very differently. Personally, the one that I look at and I want to start painting again immediately is this one down here, and it's because I know that the colour distribution is absolutely fabulous, and especially around here I can go in and add more layers. Now, when I was saying about richness of colour earlier as well, if you look at the Arche paper, look how dark that tree trunk is compared to the other ones. That is exactly the same paint once again. Exactly the same paint. And it's just absolutely night and day. And to be fair, the background that I have gone on to there is still quite pale. It's only slightly darker than some of these, and yet the purple that's gone on top of it is so rich and so deep, and that's really where your money's going in expensive paper. If I had to choose, I would not buy the WH Smith paper, and I would also not buy the Faber-Castell watercolour paper, because I think that for less money you can do just as good a job with the mixed media paper. So those would be my preferences. Obviously, depending on how serious you are about watercolour and depending on your budget and also how often you're going to watercolour, they're all huge factors in deciding how much you're willing to spend on a pad of watercolour paper. So I hope this has helped you in some way. I've tried to be as impartial as possible and just give my own personal feelings, you know, sort of intermittently, but I hope this has given you enough information to make a bit more of an informed decision, or at least try some papers out. But the mixed media paper has really surprised me, and I would definitely give that a bash again, although I might keep the wet on wet washes to a minimum, I think. Alright guys, well that is it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this little video, and that it's been of some use to you. It's certainly been of some use to me, I can tell you that for nothing. And I think I'm going to go and finish off these paintings. I might just do a little set of them and try and make them all pretty. Thanks so much for watching guys, and we'll see you next time in the cave. Bye for now.